Hello, and welcome to Radical Engagements, a show at Farmvlog. And we'll continue our reading and verbal annotation of Alvin J. Gouldner's Two Marxisms. While this is part 3 of the series, it is part 2 of the chapters. And I'm going to only do the introduction and the chapter known as Marxism as Science and Critique. And then I'm going to probably, for patrons, do a reading group on the rest of the book. So if you're interested, you can become a patron. I want to remind people that I'm not, totally abandoning Marxism, but I do think we have to critique it and deal with it as it is to get beyond normalization, trying to pretend problems that are clearly there aren't there, or stagnation and decadence, which is just beating our head against the wall, are revising things into incoherence where we don't even know what we're referring to anymore and are constantly pulling from new and different theories without saying we're doing it to make all the ends meet. So this is from Gouldner's posthumously published in 1980, The Two Marxisms. This is chapter 2, Marxism as Science and Critique. Marxism and theorists of the Marxist community have been divided, it has long been noticed, into roughly two tendencies, one conceiving as Marxism as critique and the other conceiving Marxism to be some kind of social science. Both critique and science are in quotations. Marxism has been divided then between the critical Marxists and the scientific Marxists, as I shall call them here. This is Varn talking. Sometimes this gets called the structural versus humanistic Marxist, but I don't think that's accurate. Eastern versus Western Marxism, which is even more vague and confusing. I think scientific versus critical actually does kind of get the theoretical divisions down in the broadest sense of the term. I don't think, obviously don't go into the different tendencies and theories and syntheses and both political and philosophical, but this is something to begin with. Marx considered the emergence of socialism as depending on the prior maturation of certain objective conditions, especially the structures of advanced industrialism, while also conceiving of capitalism as producing these conditions through the operation of its own blind, impersonal, and necessary laws. Thus viewed, capitalism as a stage of social evolution destined to give rise to another higher phase of society, socialism. At the same time, Marx does not think of his theory simply as a social science, the view of the clubby academicians who want to normalize Marxism into something familiar. It is also a doctrine of violent revolution. Marxism is not attempting to simply understand society. It does not only predict the rise of revolutionary proletariat that will overthrow capitalism, it also actively mobilizes persons to do this. It intervenes to change the world. The problem is that if capitalism is governed by the lawful regularities that doom it to be supplanted by a new socialist society, parentheses, when the requisite infrastructures have matured, parentheses, why then stress the point is to change it? Why go to great pains to arrange capitalism's funeral if the demise is guaranteed by science? And why must persons be mobilized and extorted to discipline themselves to behave in conformity with necessary laws by which it would seem they would in any event be bound anyway? This is Varn speaking. This is more of the inevitability crisis of Marxism. Did Marx think socialism is inevitable? What did he mean by that, and when? In his famous 11th Thesis on Feuerbach, Marx had that philosophers have not only interpreted the world in various ways, the point is to change it. This surely reads as if Marx was calling on people to put forth an effort to change the world in reality and not just in thought. Yet the question is, what obliges them to do so? Marx does not reply by invoking some general idea which he holds the incumbent on persons, for he supposes such ideas are only the reflexes of class interests. As Marx said, communism was a real movement that evolves as the present state of society. not just an ideal. But if communism is the only real social movement expressing the laws of society, then Marx was just describing and validating his description of the social world, either predicting what will happen or stating what has already happened. Yet in the 11th thesis, he is clearly doing more. He is urging persons to undertake action, i.e., quotations, praxis, unquotations. The 11th thesis surely cannot be understood as saying that impersonal laws govern society, rather that the purported actions of men and women to which Marx urges them can shape human destiny, and this implies human effort and purpose, and ideas shaping them influence the outcome of human actions. There is then a tension between Marxist dismissal of idealism and his call to change the world. And it is a contradiction in Marx that existed almost from the beginning. Marx was paradoxically an idealistic materialist who suppressed his own idealism, declaring that he was not really pursuing an ideal, but like Socrates was only the midwife, delivering what had already been prepared in the womb of history and calling on others to do likewise. This ambiguity is actually reproduced in his conception of praxis. Marx has two tacitly different conceptions of praxis, or, as I will usually call it here, practice. Praxis, it is the unreflected labor on which capitalism rests, is the wage labor imposed necessary by necessity, which operates within the confining property of institutions in its studying division of labor. When labor inflicts an alienation upon workers, it constitutes the foundation of that society, reproducing the very limits, crippling workers. Here, workers are constrained to contribute to the very system that alienates them. The conception of praxis is congenial to scientific Marxism. And the second, more heroic concept of praxis, praxis 2, more congenial to critical Marxism, emphasizes in its practice that the more freely chosen, but especially on political struggle. If praxis 1 is constrained by labor and reproduces the status quo, praxis 2 is free labor contributing towards the emancipation from it, i.e. labor. In undertaking the first form of labor or practice, persons submit to necessity, and the second, however, they undertake deliberate and Promethean struggle against it being necessity. That's foreign adding there. And one part, then, Marxism is philosophy of praxis, and another part is the science, i.e. the political economy of laws of capitalism. Marxism is thus a tensionful conjunction of science and politics, of theory and practice. Its topic is the objective social and economic conditions imputedly requisite for socialism. Its object in addressing that topic, however, is not only understanding, but also a revolutionary practice aimed at changing the world. It must accomplish this, as all politics does, partly by appealing and arguing with people, by attempting to persuade them through rational discourse and promises. For politics never assumes that since history is on our side, we may wait for things and people to come our way, but premises that outcomes depend upon the active mobilization of people. So Marxism is both a science and an ideology, rational understanding and political praxis, reports about the world and command to do something about it. Yet there is also an irreducible tension between the call to do something now and the warning that those who do not wait for the appropriate conditions or use scientific guidance are dangerous adventurers, are mere utopians. Marxism as a science premises that some things will happen without men's rational foresight, whatever their efforts. As politics, however, it also premises that events depend crucially on people's efforts, struggle, and capacity for sacrifice and self-discipline. Indeed, while all politics premises men must seize the time, science premises that things have their own nature and rhythms. The two readings of Marxism briefly outlined here have, in part, grown up around the nuclear tension between voluntarism and determinism, between freedom and necessity. Both of these readings, let me hasten to insist, are truly parts of Marxism. We are not faced with only a seeming contradiction that can be glibly resolved by claiming that one side is false, revisionist, opportunist, misguided, not really Marxist, while the other side is authentic, genuine, dyed-in-the-wool, true revolutionary article. Our two Marxism theses maintain that both are, in fact, structural differentiations of a single, originally undifferentiated Marxism. Over time, the two emerge in part out of an effort to reduce the real internal tensions of the original Marxism. And the two Marxisms could not emerge as structurally distinct tendencies, but for the fact where both were truly present in Marxism. Their conjunction in ordinary Marxism is recurrently productive of the tensions and of the tension-reducing segregation of the two inconsistent elements. By insulating them from another into two more or even more distinct and boundaried systems of elaborated Marxisms, critical and scientific Marxism. As I will document, Marxism did indeed say that capitalist society was governed by blind and necessary laws to which persons were inescapably subject. But it is also true that Marxism treats persons as free agents who not only do what they must, but can also respond to appeals and be won over against their own class interests. This is both determinism and voluntarism in Marxism. As the Communist Manifesto remarks, a small section of the ruling class cuts itself adrift and joins the revolutionary class, just as, therefore, in an earlier period, a section of the nobility went over to the bourgeoisie, so now a portion of the bourgeoisie goes over to the proletariat, and in particular, a portion of the bourgeoisie ideologists who have raised themselves to the level of comprehending theoretically the historical movement as a whole. If blind laws of economics imprison people, it is evident that Marx and Engels believe that theoretical enlightenment may cast the scales from their eyes and strike the shackles from their hands. Theory might make persons, or at least some persons, free, and indeed, they had at some point earlier in the German ideology. The consciousness of the fundamental revolution, the communist consciousness, may, of course, arise amongst other classes in the impoverished working majority, too, through the contemplation of the situation of the impoverished class. No one better caught the impatient voluntaristic spirit of the critical Marxism and its epistemological inclination of that voluntarism than did the young Max Horkheimer. This is a Horkheimer quote. Present talk of the inadequate conditions is a cover for tolerance of repression. For the revolutionary, conditions always appeared right. Whatever appears in retrospect as a preliminary state or premature situation was once for a revolutionary a last chance for change. A revolutionary is with the desperate people from whom everything is on the line, and not with those who have the time. The invocation of a scheme of social stages which demonstrates post festum the importance of a past era was at the time an inversion of theory and politically bankrupt. Critical theory rejects the kind of knowledge that one can bank on. It confronts history with the possibility that is always concretely visible within. Mankind is not betrayed by the untimely attempts of revolutionaries, but ultimately by the attempts by realists. And that is from oh well. In distinguishing between the critical and scientific Marxisms, there is, however, no intention of suggesting that the voluntarism-determinism differentiation is the deepest essence or truest meaning of the larger distinction. It is but one marker in a larger set of elements constituting the two syndromes. The precise relationship of the elements and their relative importance for the larger syndrome remain to be established empirically. It's interesting to read such a pro-revolutionary statement from Max Horkheimer. Very interesting to read that indeed. And I think that is quite interesting for where we find Marxism today. And one of the things is, I would say the scientific Marxism and structural Marxism have become, more avoidant. The Authoritarian State in Telos from spring 1973, page 11. That's where that's from. That's interesting, but that's a translation of young Horkheimer. All right. It's interesting seeing that there. And also realizing that both the voluntarism and determinism become muddled. I've talked about this in terms of the warm and hot stream, or at least I've talked about it from Ernst Bloch, which I really got from the Regrettable Century people who picked it up. The warm and cold streams of Marxism. The warm is the humanistic and critical, and the cold is the deterministic and scientific. But Bloch is pretty clear that one can flip and become the other. And I think that's something that may be missed here. But the reason why that can happen is because they're both in Marx, and they're both in Engels, and they're both in the First and Second Internationals. Voluntarism versus determinism as a deep structure. We'll pick this up. The tension between voluntarism and determinism within Marxism, and around which they're caught the two Marxism, is not the special plight of Marxism. In fact, it is in fact only the expression within Marxism of the larger conditions common to social theory, to academic sociology, no less than Marxism. It has thus been observed repeatedly that sociological theories may be grouped around two poles. The first present us with a view of society as a network of human meanings and embodiments of human activity. The second presents us with society conceived as a thing like facticity, standing over and against its individual members with coercive controls and molding them in socializing processes. The first view presents us with man as a social being and with society as being made by him, whereas the second view sets society over as an entity over and against man and shows him as being made by it. This crucial problem of sociology is not to find clever ways in which these two standpoints can be harmonized, but rather to accept that the institutions made by men do somehow acquire certain giveness opposed to their makers, and to study the manner in which the strange objectivity comes about. One must take seriously the objectivity of social existence and relatedness to human subjectivity, and ask how it is possible for human activity to produce a world of things. And that's a quote. I'm going to have to look up these quotes real fast. Excuse me. So both those quotes are from the first one is from the Gutman scale, and the second one is from Peter Berger and Stanley Poolberg, which is Reification and Sociological Critique of Consciousness, from the New Left Review from February edition of 1966, which is also discussed in Gouldner's own book, The Coming Crisis of Western Sociology. Okay. I think that's an interesting point. This is a point about all people who are deterministic yet also engage in any kind of intervention. We must propagandize determinism is always a weird thing because, well, propaganda is actually voluntaristic in its very nature. Determinism is not. To need to propagandize for a deterministic universe is essentially a self-contradiction, and yet it's one that we see all the time. Not just amongst Marxists. I remember this thing called naturalist humanism, which was hard deterministic, but also thought we needed to convince people that hard determinism was real, and then would do some weird hand flipping about what agency meant to make that work in ways that were basically incoherent from a straightforward articulation. Okay. Back to this. But it would be intellectual parochialism to imagine that this problem existed only for sociology or for social science. Modern philosophy itself reproduces some of the very limits, and in particular, the tension between voluntarism and determinism. The tension between existentialism and structuralism is a familiar case in point. Quote, existentialism focuses on creating meaning, structuralism focuses on the structures of meaning as pre-given. Existentialism assumes that social actors are moral agents who, in principle, are able to consciously intend their own conduct. Structuralism assumes intentions are superintended by the deeper structures of the mind laying behind or beneath actors' conscious awareness. nor that the dissonance between voluntarism and determinism particular only to modern secular thought, as is a tension between free will and natural law in Christian theology, which has long been indicated. In fact, centuries-long debate was but the theological scholasticism of early encounter with the dilemma where, as in many other spheres, religion's insight was preceded by myth in an earlier imprinting culture of ancient Greece. In the Greek view, there was sacred law by which men were bound, and there were divisions of the cosmos by fate, or moria, into distinct spheres by which even the gods themselves were bound. There was, in short, necessity. Yet to pursue a course of conduct simply out of necessity was a slave's way, and a free people insisted that on going to their fate, even if it were death itself, out of their own free will. It was slavish for persons to be dragged to their fate. Free people would face it unblinkingly. Even if the fates have spun death for a man, said the poet, he should always march straight forward carrying his spear. When Oedipus sins, the land of these suffers for it, yet Oedipus could sin. Law and destiny were imposed upon humanity, yet they were not robots and could and conform to their destiny or struggle against it. The Greek necessity then did not contain the idea of the absolutely impossible. The boundaries around people, their destiny could indeed be stretched or breached, at least momentarily. All that the law ensured was that the retribution for the breach, but could not prevent it from happening. The forbidden is not the same as the impossible, it is merely the costly, and men can do proscribed things if they are prepared to pay the price. Such, at any rate, was something of the way in which the Greeks expressed the tension between, or sought to reconcile, freedom and necessity. The tension between voluntarism and determinism and Marxism, then, is part of a deep structure of Western thought that it shares, and Marxism did not invent this tension, and it did not resolve it. All right. Critical and scientific Marxism, the larger paradigms. And then we'll stop after this. I think I want to discuss a little bit. So far, I'm in agreement with the tensions here and also have pointed out that these tensions aren't new or unique to Marxism. I often play with these tensions when I confront like the different elements of countercausal free years, pounded in absurdity, nothing causes itself, a self-causal agent is circular. Compatibilism, you're just trying to avoid the problem. Hard determinism, well, if we have to argue for hard determinism, then we are doomed to believe in free will, since most people do, and they are determined to do so. So your entire argument is irrelevant. Now, that may seem like a child's argument, but sometimes a child's argument is actually the correct way to clarify what is otherwise obscured by levels of mystification through words. Anyway, critical and scientific Marxism, the two larger paradigms. As the different elaborated paradigms of Marxism, critical and scientific Marxism emerge under different social historical conditions and among different persons and in differentiated social networks and groups. It seems clear that some who were critical Marxists at one point in their lives may change and become scientific Marxists at a later time, and vice versa. Side note, this is why I like the Ernst Bloch warm and cold streams of Marxism, because it's easier to change temperature than it is to change type. And the water exhibits both properties. But anyway, I just pointed out that Ernst Bloch had realized some of the same things that Gouldner had realized far before Gouldner did. The role of critical Marxism includes that of George Lukács, the early Karl Kurz, Antonio Gramsci, Jean-Paul Sartre, Lucien Goldman, Randolph Barrow, Shlomo Averny, who ended up being a communitarian later, Carmen Claudian Urando, the Telios Circle in its more Lukácsian days, Victor Perez Diaz, the News and Letters groups in Detroit. That's people who have become the Marxist Humanist Initiative and the International Marxist Humanist Group when they split. Members of the and such members are one-time members of the Frankfurt School, such as Max Horkheimer, Friedrich Adorno, Franz Neumann, Leo Lowenthal, Edric Fromm, Walter Benjamin, Herbert Marcuse, and in a second generation, such as Albrecht Velmer, Alfred Schmidt, or Jürgen Habermas. We only really still talk about Habermas. And I'm going to go ahead and contest. Horkheimer and Adorno are the second generation. The first generation of Frankfurt School are Austro-Marxist in Frankfurt. But anyway, I'm not going to push on that anymore. I'm a minority there who thinks we need to talk about Gross and Gross and the early Frankfurt School, who basically had Austro-Marxist views. As opposed to this distinguished group, there are many other Marxists who eschew critical theory as mere ideology and who conceive of Marxism as a true science. They include such men as Galvano della Volpe, the Marxist Mandarin of the École Normale Supérieure, Louis Althusser, those influenced by him, including Nikos Polanyias, Maurice Goldele, Andre Glockman, Charles Bettelheim, the intellectual leader of the Swedish outpost of Lund, Göran Thurbon, and the editor of the British New Left Review, Robin Blackburn. The boundaried socialist networks of the two Marxism is indeed a sociological shell of an intellectual skirmish that has manifested itself among Marxists for some 50 years now. Some of this theoretical tension is and organizes a conflict between those supporting and those rejecting the importance of Hegel's from Marx, and between those using and those rejecting a more Hegelian conception of ideological critique. But both the scientific and critical Marxism tend to view ideology differently, and their critique of ideology differs as well. As a side note, I do want to point out, though, that most of the early scientific Marxists are what we might call, from the Blanc scale, cold stream Marxists, were Hegelians until Althusser. They focus on the science of logic as opposed to the phenomenology of spirit as their primary Hegelian text, but they were there. Russell Jacoby's Dialectic of the Feet goes into this pretty well. I don't agree with everything Jacoby says, and we should remember that scientific and critical Marxism can exist within the same tendencies. There are critical and scientific Marxism and French Maoism, and Chinese socialism, in the Soviet Union, etc. And in fact, the tensions there is actually going to be spelled out by Gouldner in the case of Cuba. So we're going to talk about Cuba a bit, where both streams exist. Right. Marxism views ideology as a distorted reflection of the world, indeed, as turned upside down by the distorting lens of self-interest, but nonetheless as a reflection mirroring, albeit weirdly, the world. Critical Marxism, however, believes that even as men go about fashioning ideological mass for class domination, they do so under the scrutiny of their own and others' critical reason, and thus seek mass that will persuade themselves and others. What makes ideologies persuasive and thus more capable of legitimizing class domination is precisely their elements of rationality and reasonableness. From the standpoint of critical Marxism, then, reason seeps even to ideology itself, and it must therefore contain something more than false and mistaken. Consequently, ideology cannot simply be shrugged aside as a mere tool of domination, or straightened out simply as transformative criticism that turns it right side up. The difference between critical and scientific Marxism reflects the conflict between those viewing Marx as the culmination of German idealism and those emphasizing the Marx superiority to that tradition. It is therefore also a difference between those who accept the young and consequently more Hegelian Marx as authentically Marxist, and others who regard the young Marx as still mired in ideology. On the other side of this division between critical and scientific Marxism, there's a set of correlated commitments, which is a mirror image of the syndrome correlated commitments on the other side. Critical Marxism and Hegelianizers conceive of Marxism as a critique rather than a science. They stress the continuity of Marx with Hegel, the importance of the young Marx, the ongoing significance of young Marx's emphasis on alienation, and are more historicists. The scientific Marxists are anti-Hegelians, have at times stressed Marx as a compur epistemology. With Hegel, after 1845, Marxism is for them a science, not a critique, entailing structuralist methodology whose paradigm is the more mature political copy of Capital than its ideologized anthropology of the 1844 manuscripts. In one part, the controversy of the young versus the old Marx is a metaphor for the more analytic distinction between critical and scientific Marxists. Critical Marxists, therefore, continually stress the continuity between the young and old Marx because the young Marx was patently as Hegelian. They wish to establish Marxism as a abiding link with larger traditions of German philosophy, of which Hegel is a culmination. Correspondingly, scientific Marxists may stress the quantum leap that the maturing Marx presumably made from ideology to science, as well as in impugning sharp differences between ideology and science in general. As a side note, I'm going to already say Gouldner is reading scientific Marxism through Althusser way more than, say, through Stalin or the pre-Khrushchevian Soviet Union or through Mao, etc., because there's not a rejection of Hegel in those early thinkers, because Lenin totally accepted Hegel. And I guess you could say that Lenin bounced back and forth between a critical and scientific Marxist. And then if we take this paradigm as valid, and I think in some broad outlines it kind of is, then Lenin's interesting because he embodies both streams, not in clean-cut periods of his life, but in different time periods and for different needs. Critical and scientific Marxisms differ in their most basic background assumptions and their epistemologies, especially in respect to the role of science as against critique. And with this respect, the domains of assumptions concerning the fundamental nature of social reality, i.e. their social ontologies. Critical Marxists stress on historicism, embodies social fluidity and change, a kind of organicism calling for a contextual reinterpretation of events. Scientific Marxists stretch out firm structures that reoccur and are presumably intelligible in decontextualized ways. This is Varngen. My critique of Gouldner right here is that I want examples very specifically, and he's given me examples of critical Marxism, but he actually hasn't given me a lot of examples of scientific Marxism. And most of his description sounds like the structuralist versus humanist debate. The difference between critical and scientific Marxism, as Russell Jacobi kind of pointed out in Dialectic of the Feet, is bigger than that. There are Hegelian and non-Hegelian forms of both sides, although critical Marxism tends to be more Hegelian. But this kind of laps onto like Western versus Eastern Marxism and these other categories, but not perfectly. And all these binaries get to something real in divisions of Marxism, but also obscure a lot too. So I would need Gouldner to give me more examples of both sides. We'll see how this goes through this chapter, and then we'll go into the book club. All right. Have a great evening and continue to engage with these readings. I'll be going through all kinds of different kind of readings, and sometimes I'm doing extensive samples of books like this, but I can't do the whole book for legal reasons. Sometimes I'm going to be selecting parts. Sometimes I'll do a whole essay that's in the public domain or is published freely online, so it's okay. And I'll provide citations or links as always. If you want to get more or want the audio for this or want to get access to Q&As or internal book clubs or all kinds of stuff that happens in my community, a lot of it isn't run by me now. You can subscribe as a patron and you can get access to the audio files as well as access to the Discord and the ability to ask me questions for as little as $3 a month. We try to make a lot of stuff available for free. As you see here, we put out a lot of material here as well. So check that out. I would like to thank my new Khan Il Kahanans. That's my $10 patrons, and they get to commission patron only episodes. Yay for them. So, and I would like to thank my new ones, and there are a few. That is Flesh Dakamura, and then also Carl Shepard, or Carl S. And I think that's the only two new ones. If I've missed any other Khan Il Kahanans, please tell me. All right. I'd like to thank you and have a great evening.